All right, friends. Well, welcome once again to our Wednesday Bible Reflection Times. We've been doing Jesus and if you haven't seen the prior episodes, you can check them all out. They're there on our church's YouTube channel. We did Jesus and mental health. That was really interesting. We did one on Jesus and Judaism with a Jewish Jesus scholar. That was great. We did one on Jesus and the Gospels. My friend Ben Witherington, he got downright emotional talking. It's like historical critical stuff, but then he got very personal and tearful, and it was really profound. Anyway, go check those out. We're doing Jesus and I thought today it'd be fun to talk about Jesus and music. I've tried to think about Jesus and music. Jesus, like the rest of us, he first heard music when he was in his mother's womb, right? That's when we all first hear music. And they had that rage a few years back, play Mozart for your child in the womb. Jesus heard his mother Mary singing. She would have sung psalms. That's how they knew psalms. When he was a little boy, they would go to the temple for Passover. I had that story when he was 12 and they got separated. He would have heard the trumpets, the choirs there. That must have been mind-boggling if you grew up in a little town like Nazareth, right? We know that Jesus and all Jews, they sang psalms, and I love that at the Last Supper it says that they sang together. I try to picture Jesus and those men in that upper room singing together. What do their voices sound like? Jesus and music, absolutely amazing. I wanted to, couldn't think of anybody better to talk to on this topic than my new friend and colleague, Dr. Hugh Floyd. Hugh, thank you for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm delighted to get to be here.
Hugh is our Myers-Briggs United Methodist Church. He is our new director of music, and we're just so pumped up that you're coming to work with us. You're here. That was a brilliant hire on my part, as I always. A little bit of how that happens. You've been teaching choral music at Furman for a long time. And we brought you in September to be our interim director of music while we searched for a director of music. And people joked, like, just hire Hugh. You weren't on the radar screen, right? But during that time, something happened. Tell people what happened and then how you became a candidate for this job.
Oh, I'll be happy to. It's a wonderful story and very important to me. Of course, I knew Myers Park already. I had the chance to travel to Europe with the group some years ago as a singer and was a guest with everyone. So I had some connection. I knew the former director very well. And so I knew the style of worship. I knew some of the members of the choir. And Evan Curry, who was serving as the interim director, had called me to ask if I would help with the Christmas concert. And as I thought about that, I don't want to just show up and do a Christmas concert. If there's time, I want to be able to get to know the choir better so that we share the Christmas concert. So I recommended him, why don't I just come and be there for a while as the interim? And in the midst of that, something strange happened.
And I'd point out, I attended your first rehearsal, not as a singer, just fly on the wall. And people were laughing, smiling. It was just an evening they fell in love with you immediately. Anyway, an evening great, Joey. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I'm delighted to hear that. I felt the same. I felt very at home, no nervousness about it, except just excitement. Yeah. And something happened in the midst of being with them for a few weeks. It's been a long time, 20 years maybe, since I've done a regular church position. And the I just liked it. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. There was a sense of we're making music together for a great purpose. There was clearly a sense of love in the choir for each other and for the needs of the church and for their purpose in worship, things that I've always valued but had put aside through my academic work. And so getting back to that was, for me, pretty remarkable. And so week after week, as I sat there in those services, listened to these sermons that reminded me of what my heart tells me, it seemed, and not just the sermons, though I enjoyed the sermons, but yes, but there's something about the service at Myers Park that is just beautiful and moving. It's from the procession to the creed to now these prayers of penitence. The order of worship is very meaningful at Myers Park for me. And I had come to the conclusion that I was going to keep coming anyway, and was trying to figure out how I could get into the choir, whether that would pressure the new choir director or not, if I happened to sing. But then, in any case, the more I thought about this, I thought maybe this is the place for me. And I prayed about that, of course, and thought about it a great deal. And it turns out the church felt the same. So I'm more excited than I can say about that opportunity. Through the Christmas season and now into the other parts of the church year.
Not too many hires work that way. It's kind of star-crossed lovers. You know, we fell in love with you, you fell in love with us, and here we are. It's a great thing. But it's all about love for God, actually.
It is.
On everyone's part.
True. And that's one of the things I really felt so comfortable with this church choir. They have that combination, and I would say the service too, but the choir is what I'm thinking about specifically. This combination of well, I guess the way Wesley says it is piety and poetry. That is, they're trying to get the music right. They want to sound good. They love the music, but they come at it with a spirit that's of worship, not just of accuracy or professionalism.
Yeah, I mean, it's not there's something performative about it, but it's not a performance. It's the choir helps us to lift our hearts toward God. Just say a little about just sort of the wonder of music and choral singing in particular. Why is that such a fitting instrument to praise God? People singing together.
I do think it is. I love that you use the word performative. I think of it as that we're sharing with the congregation texts that we know and tunes that we know that we want to share with them, and our own sort of devotional material with that, our own expression of that. So music is compelling to us, and not sure anybody knows why or when that started. I teach history courses in music, and we generally start with Gregorian chant. And and I have to remind the students and myself, that was 1100 or so. For thousands of years before that, people sang, and in every culture people were singing, and there was music in the spheres, music from the beginning of time. So I think it's in our body. There's something musical in us. Our music history is about the music we've written down, and that's a different thing. Right. And so in any case, there's something compelling about music that's hard to describe. Even people that say the old expression, as I have a tin ear, or that think they can't hear or they can't tell the difference, there's still songs that bring up memories and emotions and ideas. Music speaks to us in ways, in fact, so powerfully that in the history of music, churches have kind of fought about music because of that, how sensual it was versus how theological it was. I mean, there's been this kind of conflict about that. And that would not be true if music wasn't so compelling. And so there's something about it that makes it so intense that people have opinions.
I mean, I'm a professional religious talker, but I know that the music takes people home, takes them somewhere that I can't quite get them. I don't fully know what that is. It's something about the singing together. If I were not preaching, I'd be in a choir. I love being in a choir. Something about doing that with others. It's not just you. It doesn't just depend on you, but it does depend on you. You're part of it. It's a big thing. I know I did before the pandemic, I did a program with Jeremy Begbie, who's a great theologian and musician. He does thing where he explains the Trinity by saying like three notes on a chord. You have da, 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 the three different notes, but they don't crowd each other out. And together they're more beautiful than just the one.
Right.
And so thinking about Jesus, when I have this early childhood memory, I was with my mother. We went to pick up my sister, whom you met. She's
right. I did just recently at a church music hall. Yeah.
And she was a little girl at the time, and she was in some choir. And so we're outside waiting for her to come out. And these girls were in there singing in harmony, Fairest Lord Jesus. I just remember thinking, that is so beautiful. But it's a hymn about the beauty of Jesus, right? We tend to think he was smart. He was a miracle worker. But there had to be something beautiful, something compelling. People dropped everything and traipsed off after him. Painters, musicians, poets, all the stuff has been done. The beauty is so great. So let's talk about some Jesus music. So
it's funny you should mention. You go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
Well, it struck me that Fairest Lord Jesus is often called Beautiful Savior, and which is the same tune, and it does express the same idea. It's curious that they changed the title to to express that aspect rather than using the older term fairest. Anyway, I find that really interesting. But there's
absolutely,
there's real beauty to that.
So let's talk about some Jesus hymns. So one that I know you love and I love is "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross." I like to, I wrote this book about hymns, and in it I try to slow down instead of hurrying on through the hymn. Let's ponder. So just when I survey, it's not when I glance at the cross, but I survey it. And that takes time. You're measuring it. You might even build something on it when you survey. And talk about "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross," ways that's been sung and what that means for you.
Well, it is one of my favorite hymns, as it is for many, many other people. Yeah. And, it's very famous in this Gilbert Martin arrangement that people do. The tune that most Americans sing is the Lowell Mason tune. And Lowell Mason is sometimes called the father of music education, of American music education. He started the Boston Public Schools music programs and sort of fought for them there. And he was hoping to find a way to express for Americans the sort of English quality of music that he felt was important, so that people could sing better in church. He felt that if people understood the hymns and were able to sing the hymns better, that they would have a closer relationship with God. So that's the tune, Lowell Mason. The text, though, Isaac Watts is exceptionally important in terms of the writing of this text, and as in terms of history of hymnody and how it works. Before that, Protestants primarily were singing hymns that were simply psalm settings. So they were, in fact, you mentioned psalmody before, which were simply translations of the Psalms in poems. But Isaac Watts took us out of that into more intense personal devotional approach to the experience of God and of Jesus Christ. And in his poetry, some of the phrases you mentioned, you see where he does indeed linger on those experiences rather than just state them in the way. Now, the Psalms, of course, have lots of that, but not as quite so much in our own language as Isaac Watts was able to do. In ways
the story about him. He's in church. He was complaining to his dad about how boring the music was. And his dad said, well, write something better for them to sing. Man, did he ever?
And did he? That's exactly right.
I love the phrases that are like sorrow and love flow mingled down. Like onlookers would have said justice and tragedy are mingled. But no, sorrow and love flow mingled down.
Yeah, it's the contrast in the tune and the text that I like so much. The this and that, he keeps saying, and that is the experience we have when we're confronted, I believe, with Jesus. It's not easily labeled as this. There's always a this and that, and there's a giving up when there's a gaining. I pour contempt on all my pride. There's contempt is not a word you would expect to see in a hymn. And it's not a word that we like to use. And there it is. And I'm supposed to do it. And so it's a curious use of it.
And if you think about the words of the song, it's got contempt, it's about crucifixion, crown of thorns, but the music though is soaring, and especially if people know the Gilbert Martin arrangement. At the end, it's just, and it's both, right? Yeah. That's Jesus' glory, is that he suffered, he loved that much, and so on. Let's talk about another hymn, Blessed Assurance. I feel like I'm going back to Baptist church with my grandparents. They love it.
Well, I will say those are the hymns I'm most familiar with.
Yeah, they speak.
They're the ones.
Blessed Assurance, Jesus is mine.
Yes, and for the longest time, I thought of that like I own Jesus in some way. I've got him and I'm safe. And, it occurred to me, it's not that at all. It's Jesus is my assurance. Blessed assurance. Jesus is mine assurance, which is how I now think of the hymn, that my assurance is in Jesus. And that has changed the way I sing that and the way I think about it. Not that I have ownership of him, or even more importantly, he has ownership of me, but that the assurance of my life and the assurance of my living is in the fact that it's him. It's through him and by him and with him. So for me, that hymn has always been there. It also gives you hints of heaven all the time in it. Angels descending, these sort of whispers of love. It's like hints of paradise. And that's what music gives you, by the way, which is why I like it. It's one of it gives you the old Episcopal prayer is give the musicians even now a glimpse of what we'll hear. And that's, I think Blessed Assurance does that for us. It reminds us that, it's not all these problems, that this is all here, but there's something else. And every now and then, if we're alert, we get hints about it here and there. And for me, that's really essential. I hold on to that, always have. And that tune is one of the ones I sing in the shower. It's it's just, how can I express this? Everyone has hymns like this. It makes me feel okay. Assurance is the right word. It makes me feel like God had providence. God has this planned. God has something. God has me. And Jesus is there. Not, I don't know, words don't do justice to that feeling, but we know it when we feel it. And
rethinking the word mine, it's not like that's mine, that's my toy, but it's mine, and that I live into it, I own it. What a lucky dog I am. Yeah. This is mine. I share in this. Another
sentence.
Yeah.
Comma, Blessed Assurance, comma, Jesus is mine, exclamation point. And so that's why I put it together.
Yeah, another hymn you mentioned to me before we started. I always think sometimes we sing in hymns words we never otherwise use. Right. Anyway, so one you mentioned is "tis."
Yeah.
How often do people say "tis"? Much less begin a sentence with "tis." 'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus.
I love that. So it turns out this year I've been remembering this Christmas for the first time. I heard some ad, and I'm not a very commercialized person. I don't watch much TV or those kinds of things. I don't remember where the ad was playing, but it kept saying "tis." The joke was "'tis the season to say 'tis."
Exactly.
Well, that's perfect. I just was so enraptured by that. It is the season to say "tis," because people do that. I think it was some event here in Greenville, but "'tis so sweet to trust in Jesus, just to take him at his word." The language. This is a really sentimental hymn, and maybe hokey. I don't know. But it is. Sweet is the right word. My father, I gave him grief about this sometimes, but when I would leave, he wouldn't say be strong, be courageous, be good. He would say be sweet. Those were the words my dad would say when I left the house. Not even be safe or be careful, but be sweet. And I thought later in my life, that's a really uncharacteristically American thing for a dad to say to his son. Both of us, Jeff, my brother, and I. And yet sweetness is important, and it's gentleness and kindness and meekness, and it's a trait that is valuable. And there's a sweetness to faith that only people who have faith can really quite understand. It's in spite of all the grief. I mean, there are bad things happen in the world. Certainly there are horrible things all around that we can look at, but there's some sense of sweetness to it where you know that Jesus is in control in whatever way. Control may be too strong a word, but there's some sense that there's a sweetness to this. There's a purpose for it. I know this from my friends, especially in academia, who don't have faith. They really struggle with how to find sweetness in life. They don't find that. They try to find value. They try to find purpose. They try to find meaning. But gentleness and sweetness and kindness, I think the word self-care is very popular right now to try to express that. That's not the same as trusting in Jesus. And so for me, it has been the thing that has gotten me through the complications of life, I guess I'd say, right? Both my own and the ones I'm looking at from the outside.
mine's never really had any complications, but if that happens one day, I'll be
fortunate you. Yeah.
I bet there are people watching who they're probably a little surprised because you're, a PhD in music, professor at Furman, that you're landing on these, use the word corny.
They are. Yeah, I would say that. I said hokey, but corny works.
I thought about that. I guess I got a theological education, but I had training in classical music. I think at some point I kind of became a snob, and those kind of old timey things. I thought, I've kind of evolved above that. Then at some point I got to thinking, just especially about my grandmother in particular, who had no education, never traveled anywhere, but as she did her chores around the house, these were the hymns that she sung, hummed, whistled, His Eyes on the Sparrow, all these things. And I thought, I actually would like to grow up to be like her.
Right.
And maybe that was part of being like her.
It might be. I went through, a period in my life when I did exactly what you were suggesting. I thought, okay, I don't like these hymns, these from the gospel tradition or from the 1800s. A lot of them sort of more sentimental, some of them have like the Stephen Foster kind of characteristic melody, which seems a little dated, and the harmonies are a little bit, schmaltzy for our taste now, and those kinds of things. And the texts sometimes are too, I walk through the garden alone, language like that. And yet maybe we don't really know about music. Maybe it's repetition. Maybe it's having heard it so long from generation to generation that it means that much to me. But I don't think so. I think there's something there that's direct and real. And I do think music can be sentimental, and then we can like something that might not be high quality just because it means something to us from a time period. For example, I'm thinking of a hymn that was very popular when I was young was Pass It On, which is in the Methodist hymnal now, which is kind of a 70s pop tune. And yet I still kind of like it. And, because it brings back a feeling of a time period. In that sense. And then, sometimes the early, for Protestants, trying to figure out how to teach people hymns. So, this was reformational, trying to get hymns, tunes, and texts that the congregation could actually do. And part of it was theology. You're getting the text in a way that people can remember these stories. But after a while, it gets to a point where you want to understand these verses of words. I mean, they get in your brain, and there's stories that are. That's why I like 4 verses. You're following something here, a poetic logic that tells you something that gives you strength. Some of the hokier ones don't quite follow through with that, and the poetry is a little bit, little more, little less appealing. But some of the earlier hymns that might be more greater musical quality, sometimes they're cold feeling, they're little, and they represent perhaps the distance of God or the power of God or the majesty of God, which, yes, is there too. I have less problem personally imagining the majesty and brilliance of God than I do the fact that he could actually like me personally. I'm sorry for getting upset about that, but it's easy for me to picture God's power. This is Hugh Floyd. But it's much harder for me to picture that he could actually care about me. And these poems from the 1800s express a really intimate and personal relationship which is in the person of Jesus, which I need to hear more often than the fact that God is powerful.
That's so well said. One of my worries with when hymnody or anything becomes sentimental, corny, is that we'll think religion, it's just corny, it's just sentiment. Right. It doesn't have challenge to it. It doesn't have depth to it. It doesn't have. So I do continue to be thankful for the hymns that, as I like to put it, they're about God. They're not about us. They're about God. So holy, holy, holy.
Right.
It's reverential, but there's joy in it. One of my favorite anthems is that Fetke.
The Majesty and Glory.
The majesty, and so that's about the majesty of God. But that piece has so much warmth and joy and beauty and hope to it. Talk about that anthem.
I can, because it does express both of those things. It's basically a setting of Psalm 8. When I consider the heavens, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained. It's a setting of that. And the first part is really mystical. In fact, I think the opening of Four Measures has this little kind of effect, which I believe is meant to be starlight or the brain starting to think about these things. So even though it's heading towards the majesty of God, it doesn't start there. It starts with, I get to perceive this. I get to take that moment to look at the stars and think about it, which is how the psalm works, right? I always picture the psalm with David sitting out there with sheep, that he was really in the dark out there in the midst of that. I think I've mentioned before the book I like, A World Lit Only by Fire. And I try to think sometimes about our biblical characters, Jesus and David and others, in a world that didn't have electricity. And it's very hard to remember that.
When they looked up at the sky, I used to say their skies were darker. Their skies were brighter.
Yes.
Right? Because there was no ambient light, and they could see so much glory and wonder up there that we miss. Yeah.
That's absolutely. And similarly in music, the world was quieter just by the sheer population. But I think, just the amount of ambient noise. But also, people didn't have a piano in every room. They didn't have radios. They didn't have computers. Noisemakers, they had drums, they had fife, but when David played the harp that soothed Saul, that must have been that major chord or whatever modal chord he played must have just come out as a breath of God. It must have been beautiful. If the only sound you could have, only music you could have, is a music you can make in your own house with no instruments.
I read that somewhere until 100 years ago, not long. If you ever heard music, it was live being performed in front of you, like through most of human history.
Absolutely. Thousands of years. That's all, nothing else. We talk a lot about, classic popular music, and that would have been folk songs if someone happened to stop by, but you couldn't hear this famous performer unless you happened to be there. It's just remarkable what we're able to perceive now. But the world must have been so different when the only music you could have was live music. I think of that with theater also. Celebrity and theater and entertainment is so important to us. But there was a time when that would have only happened once a year. You basically had to entertain yourself. And you had traveling actors that would come through every once in a while, maybe the troubadours, but only if you're wealthy. It must have been really something. I mean, how creative must these people have had to be to try to keep themselves engaged all of that time, if they had any time that they weren't working, of course.
Yeah. What do you hope will happen when we're in worship and Evan starts on the organ and we stand to sing a hymn, the choir people? What do you hope is going to happen?
I tell you what I hope, and I tell you what I believe, and they're almost the same, but not quite. I believe what happens is that music reaches into people in a way that they don't even know when they're doing it. That they hear these hymns, these anthems, these activities week after week, and it, in essence, seeps into their life. It becomes a part of who they are, and it changes their inner being to make them more aware of God and of our purposes in this world. I think music can do that. It sneaks behind the logic and the kind of I disagree with that mentality that is so common right now. Someone posts something up, we feel like we have to respond. Yeah. Music calls for a response, but not right away. It kind of sneaks it in there, and it takes a little while. And I think it can reach people whether they want to. We're doing this tuneful piece on Sunday by Joseph Martin. And Brian said after rehearsal, "Thanks a lot. That's going to be stuck with me all night." Yeah. And I thought, good, that's what I want. And I want this hymn to be stuck with you. And it's not all tunes do that, but some do. And then when you're, I don't know, at the last moment, you're thinking, and this is how I feel about What a Friend We Have in Jesus. Suddenly that song is in my head. I don't know where it comes from, but it changes me in that sense. The other thing I do, I would hope, though, I believe that's what happens. What I would hope is that somehow in the singing, the congregation members taste the words of what they're looking at, that a different verse strikes them each week, that some weird word that they would not use during the work week suddenly pops out at them. And they think, oh, I hadn't seen that word in a long time. What does that mean? And that in the midst of singing, they feel this, well, I would call it the Spirit of God, but they start to feel transported from their normalcy into part of the bigger community of people in heaven. I believe that's possible, and I think that happens with music. I totally believe that happens at pop concerts, that part of the holding up the candle and all this, it's not, if you were there by yourself with the person, it wouldn't be that experience. But there's something about the communal aspect of that we're doing this together. And I believe congregations have to do that. I think that's why one reason I love Mount Myers Park is that we do lots of hymns, and we sing.
Yeah. I was going to make that my last question, but it reminds me of something I meant to ask you earlier. So let me try to ask this delicately.
Okay.
There have been a lot of arguments in our lifetime about style of music and worship, right? And so there are those who go, oh, traditional music, worship, that's boring. We want a more contemporary style. I've tended to say the style is less important than it's the content. But I even wonder about style, because I had this weird thought one year. People were saying, I like to hear the music that I like in church. And it dawned on me that I love hymns out of the hymnal. I'm just like that kind of guy. But it occurred to me, I'm not sure that's the kind of music I love. The kind of music I love when I'm on my own, I listen to Chopin,
right,
which is not like a hymn. I listen to Led Zeppelin, which is not like a hymn. I listen to Carole King, the different artists. None of those are like hymns. It's almost like it's its own kind of music.
True.
And I began to think, I think that's important to me because this is sacred, not stuffy. It's like this music is for God. What are your thoughts on music?
That's really interesting. I don't listen to sentimental music from the 1800s as my norm either. That's not right. That would be, who would that be? Stephen Foster, I Dream of Jeannie, Jenny Lind singing things. I mean, goodness, there are bunches of them. There are thousands of songs. Early, the ones people might know are really early songs from musicals, like Richard Rodgers.
Oklahoma.
Yeah. I'm thinking even earlier than that, Showboat. Only make believe I love you. Those, so these or
I sing that way to Lisa at night.
Yeah. Or, late Gilbert and Sullivan, the operetta style, from the 1800s, that would have been the norm. And in fact, a lot of churches had a quartet of soloists that did those kinds of things in the 1800s in the United States. So I don't know, style changes. So there's no question style changes. And that's a good thing. It's curious. In the 60s, there was I thought we were going in a totally different direction than we ended up going. I was sort of told that we would get used to more sort of sturdy hymns that had modern harmonies and kind of, I don't know if you remember this time period, but they were kind of new hymns that were not popular in their style, but more sort of intellectual in their approach. There were a lot of these arrangements done, and that didn't really work. Right. And in the Baptist church that I grew up in, we had what I would call I don't know if we officially called it, but morning hymns and evening hymns. And in the Anglican tradition, that means hymns that have to do with morning and hymns that have to do with evensong. But in the Baptist church, that means the good ones in the morning and the gospel ones that everyone liked at night. Right. And so that was kind of the bar line. Every now and then you'd get to do one of these gospel things in the morning, but it was very, yeah, a little sketchy for the music director to allow that, So I don't know. To be honest, I go on back and forth about this in my own life. There are songs and tunes, and I grew up before contemporary Christian music became a thing. I mean, it happened in my lifetime, but the first ones I remember are Amy Grant and Keith Green. And if I look that up, people talk about as that being the beginning of this style. There were not many people before that as a separate entity. And that music is still very meaningful to me. I think the music of Keith Green, especially, his lyrics are compelling, and the style is sort of 70s pop that I didn't really listen to, but it means something to me. But I don't suspect that means something to people that weren't 17 when they were listening to that. So I think the challenge as someone who's trying to help other people with music, in other words, sharing music with others, is to figure out which pieces are going to stay and still have value, and which ones maybe it's time for us to move along. And I don't have an answer to that. And I think kindness is the main key. I'll give the example of food. I'm trying to learn to make things that aren't Southern food with lots of butter.
Why?
Well, I mean, I would just assume have a party with, old Swedish meatballs, and, you dip it in cheese sauce, and the kinds of sandwich things we had when I was growing up at events. But I can't have my friends over to serve gravy on rice. They have couscous, and they have, things are healthier. And that's food, that's style in one sense. It's not really substance. I don't know. Change is difficult for everybody, and I go back and forth. I'm all over the place about this, but kindness is the key, I think. And I don't think that Jesus. Let me say this, and I'm no one to speak for Jesus, but I suspect he doesn't really care about musical style. In the same way, he doesn't care what house we have or what clothes we wear. I think Jesus cares about how we approach our life and I would say our art. This is not in my brain excuse you can just do whatever and it's fine. I don't mean that. But Jesus always seems to cut sideways across things. In other words, he wouldn't have this discussion. He would come up with some other way of thinking about this.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
And I'm sure he looked down at my grandmother singing in the kitchen and loved that. And in the same way, music can be revolutionary. So during the civil rights movement, people wander around singing, "We shall overcome." And Jesus was like, yeah.
That's right.
All across, very different styles, all about doing Jesus stuff, all with the love and mercy that you're talking about. Hugh, we could talk all day about these things, and I'll have to have you back another time and talk about some other hymns, which would be great. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. It's always fun to talk about this. It's deep on my heart, and I hope that we're both able to lead the congregation to greater worship experiences through music.
That's what it's going to be all about. All right.